Welcome to the London History Podcast. I'm your host, Hazel Baker, qualified London tour guide at londonguidedwalks.co.uk. Today we're stepping back into a very different London, one that looked outward across the seas, its merchant ships pushing into dangerous Arctic waters and later voyaging as far as the Pacific. Our focus is whaling, a brutal, perilous, yet enormously important trade that shaped the city's economy, culture, and global reach from the early 1600s right through to the 19th century. The story doesn't begin in London. For centuries, Basque whalers have been hunting in the Bay of Biscay, developing techniques that would later be carried into the Arctic. As European powers competed for control of new fishing and whaling grounds, London found itself joining a race, backed by powerful trading companies, ambitious merchants, and a growing demand for oil and Baleen. Whaling was never just about the hunt itself. Whale oil lit streets and homes, powered industry, softened leather, and lubricated machinery. Baleen, strong yet flexible, shaped fashion, everyday objects, even the suspension of carriages. And behind those commodities lay stories of exploration, rivalry with the Dutch, ventures backed and broken by capital, and eventually vast southern expeditions led by London entrepreneurs like the Enderbys. To guide us through this extraordinary history, from the bays of Biscay to Spitsbergen's ice, from corset stays to Arctic disaster, I am joined once again by historian and fellow tour guide Ian McDermid. Today we'll explore how London became, for a time, the world's greatest port, and why, by the mid-19th century, its dominance was already in decline. All right, so let's get into it. Whaling from London really begins in the 1600s, but of course the story doesn't start there. In places like the Bay of Biscay, Basque whalers had already been active for centuries, and other European powers were also entering the trade.
Well, the Bay of Biscay is the first documented place where whaling in the sense of hunting for whales takes place, and it dates back to the 11th century. So people had caught whales before then, but they're relying on stranded whales, getting a whale caught in a narrow confines of water, and not going out in boats to collapse them, which is what the Biscayans are doing. And the written evidence goes back to the 11th century for this. And it's not entirely clear which animal they were hunting. So the whale that they're hunting is called the Biscayan whale, in Latin Baleen biscayensis. And from the way they used it, it's obviously similar to what people in the 16th and 17th centuries would later call the right whale, but it's not at all clear. And what happens in the Bay of Biscay is a model for what's going to happen, because this is the first place that they're hunting whales. It takes a lot longer, and that is that the stocks become depleted. And at the end of the 15th century, there are records of the people from Biscay going all the way over to the Gulf of Labrador to hunt for whales. But they also realise that there are whales further to the north in the Arctic. But the move to the north is actually going to be dominated by the English and the Dutch. And the English, and when we're talking about English, throughout this period, London is by far and away the largest whaling port throughout all the English activity. And the English are really active as whaling, directly in whaling from 1600 to 1850. The trade itself is very volatile, and the English suffer from competition from the Dutch and from American colonialists. The really active parts for English whaling in terms of persistently sending ships out are the early 17th century and then the late 18th and into the early 19th century. And one of the extraordinary things, Hazel, is that in that latter period, from roughly the 1780s to roughly the 1820s, London is actually the largest whaling port in the world.
In the world?
Yes, it's quite extraordinary. It all comes to a rather grinding halt, which we'll come into. Essentially, the British government champions free trade and the import duties on American oil are cut dramatically. And this was death of English whaling. And in the later 19th century, the trade will be dominated by the Norwegians. And then in the 20th century, things change again with technology, with factory ships, with modernization, which allows them to use whale oil and margarine. And then the biggest buyer for whale oil in the world in the 20th century will be Unilever. Christian Salvador is another company. But in terms of sending out whaling fleets each year, London is active from 1600 to about 1850.
And at this point of period, it's the Dutch and the English. Those ships are pushing into Arctic waters, developing what became known as the Northern Fishery. A key motivation was the search for the Northeast Passage to Cathay and the East Indies. But they never found that route. But they did find an abundance of whales. Can you explain how this shift shaped whaling and what it meant for England's role in particular in the trade?
Yeah, the key location here, although they're sailing off the north and looking for the Northeast Passage, the key thing for us is what is now known as the Svalbard archipelago, of which the main island is Spitsbergen. Back in the day, it was just known as Spitsbergen. Spitsbergen was discovered in 1596 by the Dutch explorer Barents, but nothing really comes of the discovery until around 1607. One important thing to note is that they've discovered Spitsbergen, but they think it's part of Greenland. Very interesting. I would love to go there. It's 78 degrees north. The capital is 78 degrees latitude. Just to orientate ourselves, London, the place from which we all orientate ourselves, is 51 degrees latitude. The most northerly point on the British mainland, John O'Groats, is 58.5. So 78 degrees latitude for Longyearbyen. It's the most northerly place inhabited in the world. If you want to get there, it's a 3-hour flight from Oslo. We're talking somewhere quite far north. If you look at a map of the Arctic ice cap, what's significant is that in theory, it's free of ice in the summer. The ice extends southwards down the east coast of Greenland, but where Spitsbergen is, it is in theory free of ice. And every now and then the temperature gets as high in August, 7 degrees centigrade. Can you imagine that? An Englishman, Henry Hudson, discovers it again. Hudson makes an unsuccessful attempt to get to the North Pole, but is blocked by ice. And when he gets back to England, he reports that the west coast of Spitsbergen is absolutely with giant whales. They inhabit the area where the ice is no longer solid but breaking up. In these upper levels of the ice edge, the waters are very rich in plankton, which are then fed on by plankton, of which krill are the best known. The whales return to the north in the spring, and on the way back, they stop off in the bays or fjords on the coast of Spitsbergen. I mistakenly used the present tense there. There are still some, but historically, that's what they did before they decimated.
It was the Muscovy Company that oversaw these early efforts. What role did the company play in organising but also financing England's first ventures into whaling?
Well, they are vital because they have a monopoly on the areas. As the name suggests, the Muscovy Company is primarily interested in trading with Muscovy, initially with the search for the Northeast Passage. There's a famous voyage in 1553 when Willoughby and Chancellor go off in search of the passage. They don't make it. Willoughby's ship is lost, but Chancellor reaches Archangel. In 1555, the Muscovy Company is founded with Sebastian Cabot and a group of London merchants, granted a monopoly on the Russian trade. And the trade with Muscovy consists of the export primarily of English woolen cloth, but also the re-export of manufactured goods from the Mediterranean. In return, the English are importing things like hemp, tallow, and cordy. They, as I say, as part of their monopoly of trading with Russia, they organised the first whaling expedition to the Arctic with 2 whale ships under the command of Jonas Paul, and very sensibly they take 6 Basque harpooners along with them, and they managed to kill 13 whales. So this is a very promising start. But unfortunately, the second ship under Captain Edge is lost to the ice, and he is subsequently rescued by another ship. Paul then comes back, finds them, claims the oil, but as he's loading the oil onto his ship, he mishandles the ballast and his ship goes over and sinks. Now, all of the sailors are rescued, nobody loses their lives, but this is obviously a bit of a financial disaster. However, the company is very much encouraged by the fact that they managed to kill 13 whales before everything went badly wrong. And in 1612, another pair of ships are sent out, and they managed to kill 17 whales plus a number of walruses. However, there's a piece of news, and that is that they, on this successful expedition, they sight other ships just off Spitsbergen, one from the Netherlands and one from the Basque country. They drive them off, but this is a very ominous sign. And subsequently, the Dutch and the English will square off against each other, using the threat of violence and occasionally against one another. And eventually they divide Spitsbergen up. So the Dutch are given the northern part of the island, and the English concentrate on...
They've already mentioned that they were hunting for what was known at the time as the right whale, so called because it was considered the right one to catch. By the 19th century, zoologists reclassified it as the bowhead whale. So can you explain what species were actually being hunted?
Yeah, it is a little bit unfortunate from a historical point of view. So in the 19th century, they realised that the right whale, as formerly known, that exists in the Arctic, is not the same animal, not the same species, not even the same genus as the right whales that are found off the coast of America. And the one that we're interested in is, as you mentioned, now known as the bowhead whale. Its Latin name is Baleen mysticotis, and it is the only within its genus. This is a little bit unfortunate because the term right whale is absolutely a term that contemporaries use. And it feels a little bit odd to me to use the term bowhead, though I think most people writing about whales use the term bowhead. Bowhead is actually quite a good name because it describes very well the shape of the mouth of these animals, which is like a bow when you see them side on. And they, as you indicated, they are the right whale, and I will probably call them right whales from this point onwards, although I'm referring to Baleen mysticotis. And there are, as I said, there are lots of reasons for why they are the correct ones to go over. The key ones are that they are slow swimming, so you can catch up with them in a rowing boat. And this is one of the pieces of technology that marks off our period. So I was saying earlier that we're going to end in around 1850. Up until 1850, they are hunting whales using rowing boats, which are known as shallops. So obviously they're limited by the speed rowers can go at, and there are only a couple of kind of whales that go that slowly, and one of them is our whale. The other key thing for whaling in this period is that the carcasses float, so that's absolutely crucial in being able to process them. And they, in addition to giving oil as a product, they also have their baleen. So when we're talking about whales, there are two broad categories of the whales. There are the whales with baleen, which feed on the plankton, and then there are whales with teeth. And the whale with teeth that will be important to us later on is the sperm whale. But when you have baleen, they are feeding on plankton, and therefore they are geographically circumscribed. They have to feed where the plankton are, whereas the toothed whales, like the sperm whales, are known as pelagic whales. That means ocean-going whales, that they can be found all over, because the sperm whale feeds on squid and cuttlefish, which can be found pretty much everywhere. And they are the right whales, bowhead whales, Baleen mysticotis. They are amazing animals, and when you start listing of all these features of them, they just sound absolutely incredible. It sounds like a kind of poem to their sublimity. And these are further reasons why they were the right whale to catch. But obviously, to a modern ear, they sound like very good reasons for not killing these animals at all. So they are massive. They grow to about 60 feet in length. They, as I mentioned, inhabit very cold waters. So their bodies have enormously thick blubber. On a right whale, this can be 12 to 18 inches, and this is the thickest of any whale. Their heads are massive. They are about 1/3 of their body size, and the skulls are massive, partly to accommodate the baleen, but also they have these massive skulls and go up and breathe. And one other feature of them swimming under the ice is that the right whale, using its historical name, has no dorsal fin, so it can swim easily underneath the ice. And because so much of their body mass is made up of these large heads and flubbers, they are extremely slow moving. They're also slow because it's the efficient way to take in the maximum amount of food for the minimum expenditure of effort. And what they do is they move around slowly, grazing throughout the sea, scooping up the plankton. And the way it works is that they take in these huge mouthfuls of seawater, expel them through the baleen, and the baleen is covered in hairs, and the krill in particular remain in the mouths and then make their way down to the stomach. One other amazing thing about these animals is that they can live for well over 100 years. Some people think that they can live up to 200 years.
Amazing animals. Whales split into two broad groups, those with baleen and those with teeth. And with the right whale, you're getting two valuable commodities. Had these uses changed?
Yes, in the Middle Ages, they're mainly using them for lighting, but also for a lubricant in the processing of textiles. So all of that continues. But the key thing in the early 17th century, from the English point of view, is the use of whale oil in the manufacture of soap. Later on, there's a House of Commons report into the industry because they're getting into trouble. And the Muscovy Company reports that 95% of its oil had been used for the manufacture of soap. And the oil is very good because it's not quite odorless, but it's very close to that. And so it's a very good ingredient to use.
And of course, baleen was used in, well, most importantly, in corsets, giving it that strong, flexible light. I remember learning about corsets being made with whalebone, but it's actually a misnomer, isn't it?
Yeah, whalebone, when people say whalebone, they normally mean baleen. These are these sheets that grow out of the upper jaw of the whale. And they in turn are incredible. They can grow to 13 feet in length, about 15 inches across. They are amazing. And as you were saying, the corsets are the most important part of demand. And I was going to say how I thought this worked, but I'm grateful you correct me because I think far more about this than I do. So I think that corsets become fashionable in the end of Elizabeth's reign at court. And when you look at those paintings from the end of Elizabeth's reign into the early part of James's reign of women, they very often have impossibly slender waists. And the corsets remain in fashion for most of the 18th century, but the market is growing incredibly. It's not just aristocratic women that are wearing them. But then I think in the 18th century, although the market's still vast, it's no longer growing. So to some extent, it's saturated. And then at the very end of the 18th century, going into the early 19th century, you then get this, what in France will be the Empire look, inspired by fashions for naturalism, for which Rousseau's a big impetus, and they abandon the corset. And that is bad news for people hunting for baleen. But then it comes back again with the Victorians.
Yeah, so my understanding with the terminology corsets, that can be stays would have been the earlier use, really. So you're about right. So swap the word corset for stays. And yeah, you see some really extreme silhouettes, even in the late Elizabethan portraits. Of course, we've got that effigy bodice with the stays for Elizabeth I that are in Westminster Abbey. You can see these really impossibly narrow waists that could only be achieved with stiff support. And then through the 17th century, stays, considering them to be a precursor for corsets, became a standard, absolute standard of women's dress, regardless of what level in society. And that gave you the long, rigid torso, and that in portraits of the Stuart court as well. But by the 18th century, corsetry was really embedded in fashion. No respectable woman would not be wearing a corset, and it was a social expectation. And though, as you say, the early decades of the century were probably in the height of demand, but by the early 19th century, it moved to a more natural classical style. And those high-waisted muslin gowns, we think the Regency period, inspired by ancient Rome and Greece, corsets fell somewhat out of favour, and you had short stays and also long stays, but they moved the waist to a different place. But then, of course, corsetry returned with force in the Victorian years, and then that's where you get the tight lacing which became a part of a very different ideal of femininity.
And so you give an overview there of what is the main source of demand for Baleen, but it has lots of uses. I don't particularly like the term, but it's often referred to as the kind of 19th century plastic. The key thing is that it's light, it's flexible, and it's got very high tensile strength. It can be used for all kinds of ornamental uses like hairbrushes and the rest of it. It's slightly out of our period, but in the 19th century, they learned to bend it a lot easier using heat. The hair on the baleen itself can also be used for the bristles for hairbrushes. It's used in the manufacture of umbrellas until replaced by steel in the mid-19th century. It comes in different grades, so it comes with different physical qualities. And one of the main uses for the stronger, heavier type of baleen was for the suspension in carriages.
I don't really want to know, but I need to, and this is by no way supporting whaling whatsoever, but how did they hunt the whales?
Yes, it's pretty grim, I'm afraid. So, as mentioned earlier, we're talking about a period when they're hunting them in rowing boats. The initial method is often called bay whaling. It's pioneered in the Bay of Biscay, and this is the method that is then transported up to Spitsbergen. The whaling ships themselves are not really involved in the capture of the animals. The whaling ships are basically just transports, taking equipment out in the spring and returning before winter. And eventually, the English and the Dutch will realise that actually it's more efficient just to leave your equipment on Spitsbergen. So they build huts and leave all of the heavy stuff there. The Dutch actually tried leaving men on Spitsbergen as well over the winter, but that had rather unfortunate results. They tried it twice and they all died. So you have men primarily on the coast, but they could sometimes be on a ship, and they're on the lookout for whales. When the whale is sighted, they launch these rowing boats. These are very heavy rowing boats known as shallots, which is a corruption of the Basque word chalupa. And these are heavy rowing boats with perhaps 6, maybe 4 oarsmen on them. This is incredibly physically arduous work because they've got to pursue the whale and they can be out there for hours and hours. And the very specified jobs within the boat that are highly specialized and very, very skilled. And one of them is that of the helmsman, who has to try to predict where the whale is next going to come up to breathe. In addition to him, you also have the harpooner, who has to launch by hand the harpoon into the back of the whale, again, requiring immense strength and skill. And then you also have the lineman who's managing the rope. The harpoon is attached to a rope, and the rope might be as much as a mile long, and made into a coil in the back of the boat. It's then fed over to the front of the boat. And once the harpoon is put into the back of the whale will dive to try and get away, and the rope goes flying after it. And one of the jobs of the lineman is to make sure that the rope and also the boat don't catch fire as the rope goes over the boat and it causes great friction. The harpoon isn't going to kill the whale, it's just embedded in the whale, but it's hooked, and it means that the whale is in effect dragging the boat along. Once a harpooner has got the harpoon in the whale, that boat will then alert the other shallops who will come up to help. Shallops will then attach their ropes to the rope around the whale, and between them they will try and get more harpoons in the whale. And what happens is that the whale dives down, then after a while the whale has to come up to breathe, and as it comes up, they will bring the rope in gradually. So it's a bit like angling. Not that I've ever been angling, but I sense this is the way it probably works. And then the hunt goes on, and the hunt can last for ages. So the quickest death that the whale is going to have is 2 hours. But the process from putting the harpoon in the back to the death of the whale could take as many as 40 hours. And I think in reciting this, as modern people, we're just horrified by the suffering of the whales. But one has to imagine also, as I say, how arduous this is for the men involved. You're talking Arctic waters. They're rowing like hell for hours on end. It's extremely dangerous because the right whale can easily flip a boat over with its tail. Actually, I should mention one of the sad things about this, that another reason why the right whale is the right whale is that they are very Pacific animals. Their only natural predator, I think, is the killer whale. And the killer whale, until very recently, has been much to the south of them. They had no reason to fear man. And so they're quite placid animals as well, but they can easily overturn and smash up one of these rowing boats. Eventually, the whale is exhausted. It comes to the surface, and then the men throw lances or spears into it, and they're trying to get a vital organ and to kill the whale off. And this works okay later on with sperm whales, but with the right whales, they're really thick blubber, it doesn't normally happen. And the whale will eventually expire normally through blood loss and exhaustion. The key thing is it floats. They row it onto the beach. The blubber is removed with these huge and extremely sharp knives in big sections. It's then cut into smaller sections, and they often use the whale's flukes, the fins on its tail, to do this. And then it's put in try-works, which are huge cauldrons, and it is all boiled in water, and then the oil is scooped off the top. And whilst this is happening, other men remove the baleen from the whale's head.
In 1637, the House of Commons had appointed a committee to inquire into the tray's decay. Why was English whaling industry at that point struggling?
In part, the struggles are those of the Greenland Company itself, because it finds it very hard to enforce its monopoly. And in particular, whalers from other ports are going out, in particular Hull and Yarmouth. In the case of Hull, they have a reasonable case because they go to law over this. The whalers from Hull argued that actually they had sent boats to this area before the charter of the Muscovy Company has been confirmed. One of the big problem that English have is that they are unable to sell the oil and the baleen abroad. They are restricted to the English market. And this is because the Dutch can prevent them. Basically, the Dutch are just so much more efficient than the English. They can undersell them at any time. And this is partly because the Dutch are just better technically at whaling. It's probably also the case that the monopoly of the Greenland Company, the Muscovy Company, is in itself not a great way to organise. One of the things that they do is to stifle competition. This may well have prevented the English from becoming a bit technically better than they were. Spitsbergen declined. So, as mentioned earlier, this is a perennial problem. They find new fisheries, as they call them. They then exploit them, destroy the stocks, and the whales become progressively harder to find. The Dutch, from their northern vantage point on Spitsbergen, they realise that if they sail directly north, they can then drift southeast, and they come to new fisheries just off the coast of Greenland. This is something that the English don't really get into. Once you go onto the coast of Greenland, that is icebound, and instead of doing bay whaling, they're now whaling inside areas where there's lots of, they call it ice fishing. You need to make sure your ships are strengthened in case they get crushed by the ice. You need superb seamanship to navigate in between all these difficulties when the harpoon whale swims underneath the ice, and how you deal with that. In addition, there is a huge problem because the try-works they've been using on Spitsbergen to process blubber are far too big to have on a ship. Later on, the Americans will innovate and have try-works put on ships, and they are dealing with the sperm whale, not the right whale. And the sperm whale is a much, much smaller animal. It uses much, much less oil, and this innovation will work. You just can't do it with the right whale. And the Dutch, they take the blubber off, they normally will haul the whale onto the ice, but sometimes they tie it alongside the ship, they hack the blubber off, and then they put the blubber into butts, which are then eventually taken to shore. But the problem is that the blubber contains bits of flesh and blood, and this rots. And as a result, the whale oil gets a really nasty smell to it, and it's stopped being used in the manufacture of soap. And as mentioned earlier, when the Muscovy Company testifies, they say that 95% of their demand came from soap manufacture. So there's been a big, big problem. The English had lost their source of whales, and also the oil, which they've been so interested in, is no longer great from the manufacturers.
While Spitsbergen is declining, do then the English then just stop whaling and give up?
No, they don't. They're always there, but the activity is minimal. However, within this period, late 17th and early 18th century, there are two concerted attempts by the English to get back into whaling. And the first of these is led by a man named Sir William Scaven, who is granted a charter in 1692 for the Company of Merchants of London trading into Greenland. And he raises initially £40,000 to equip the largest fleet to sail from England to the Arctic in 50 years. And that capital is then later increased to 82,000. So it's a huge, huge venture. And the reason he thinks that there's an opportunity for it is that the Dutch are in all kinds of problems. They dominate the trade, but in the 1680s and 1690s, they're having lots of trouble because of the war with France. And unfortunately, the Dutch, for Scaven, are actually able to revive. His venture is not particularly well managed, and all of the capital is eaten up well before the 14-year charter expires. The second attempt to really seriously revive the English whaling trade comes about because of the South Sea Company. So we did a podcast on the South Sea Company, and one of the key things about the South Sea Company is you have the bubble, 1720, the share price collapses, and what's left of the company is looking for a quick way to turn things round. And there's a very persuasive man by the name of Henry Elkin who tries to persuade the board and eventually is successful in saying, look, the problem with Scaven and the problem with the previous attempts at English whaling is that they've just not been taken on seriously. They've not been managed well enough. And he persuades them to invest a huge amount of money into a venture. And one aspect of this is the development of Greenland Dock. If you walk around that area today, you can still see the basin of Greenland Dock. It becomes Greenland Dock because the South Sea Company take out a large lease on it, a long lease on it, and they use that dock to fit out this expensive new fleet. They also build new boiling houses for the blubber. They build warehouses. They build accommodation for staff. It's all hugely expensive. And in the first year of activity, they're able to catch 25 whales, which is pretty good. But in the second year, that goes down to 16 whales and then losses. And in 1731, they cease the activity. And in 1733, all of the ships and stores are sold off. And indeed, Greenland Dock is then leased out to somebody else.
In the early 18th century, leadership in whaling then passed from the Dutch to the Americans, and there was also a shift in both the location of whaling and the species targeted. What drove that change, and how did it reshape the industry?
Well, in a way, it's pure good fortune from the whaler's point of view. So the American colonists, pretty much from the beginning, are interested in whaling, and they're catching the American version of the right whales. Nantucket, which is a small island off the coast of Massachusetts, is the main centre for this. In 1712, a boat from Nantucket is blown off course by a storm, and the captain approaches a then unknown species of whale, kills it. This is the first time that they've caught and captured and indeed processed a sperm whale. As we mentioned earlier, one of the key things about the sperm whale is it's a toothed whale, which means that there's no baleen to process, but the oil from its blubber is worth several times as much as the oil from a right whale. It's paler, it's got much better quality. There's less of it, we should say, because the sperm whale is smaller. And then in addition, you get the so-called spermaceti, which is liquid wax contained in the case, which is a cavity in the skull of the whales, and it's called spermaceti because initially people discovering thought it was the whale's sperm. Biologists, I understand, aren't quite sure what it is actually there for, but the assumption is that it's probably to help the whale with echolocation. But this liquid wax is of enormously high quality, and they start using it for candles. And spermaceti candles just take off. London, certainly from the 1750s, probably a bit earlier than that, are illuminated by spermaceti candles, which give out a very bright flame and is completely odorless. There's so much less of it on the sperm whale. You can process it on try-works on the ships. This is an extremely efficient way of processing the whale. And the English because of the success of the Americans at doing this, they're operating close to home. The English ships aren't going after the sperm whale. What the English ships are doing is they're crossing the Atlantic and then buying the oil from the American whalers and then taking it back. And England, over this period, is importing 4 times as much whale oil from its New England colonies as it is from its own Greenland fleet.
After 1750, the English and particularly the London whaling trade saw a revival. What factors lay behind this resurgence?
First of all, the northern fishery, which is the traditional Arctic one, there's a deliberate government attempt to encourage it. They increased the bounty on oil. This goes up to 40 shillings a ton spelt TUN, for ships over 200 tons. And this means that a whaling ship is averaging about £600 in terms of a government bounty. Secondly, there is a gradual decline in the Dutch presence, that's opening the door to the English. And then French hostility and unofficial war breaks out between Britain and France in 1754 essentially over Canada, means that the American fisheries are directly threatened. And in addition, the English whaling activity is now in the hands of independent merchants and ship owners. So we were saying in the earlier period, it's the Muscovy Company, and then you have these monopolistic companies like the South Sea Company who try to barge in. Now, the trade is organised by independent merchants and ship owners who have got much more, sorry to use the cliche, but they've got much more skin in the game. They're much more agile. They're much more entrepreneurial. And then perhaps key is that there's huge rising domestic demand for the products of the whales due to industrialisation and the concomitant development of expanding towns and cities. And whale oil, one of the key uses for it is the cleansing of the woolen cloth. And when we're talking cheap woolen cloth, one huge market for this is all the military uniforms. Mills and mines use lubricants for their machinery, so they're using whale oil. Whale oil is used for the manufacture of paint, varnish, and putty, so all of that building work that's going on, huge demand. And then also you see the emergence of a big market for illumination. So 5,000 street lamps are installed in London in the 1740s. They are burning whale oil. And then finally, we should perhaps mention that the cotton mills are using lamps for working after dark.
Another major development is the American Revolution. This is probably the biggest development, actually. First of all, this damages the American competition hugely. Much of the American whaling fleet is wiped out. But then, crucially, after the war, the American colonies are no longer American colonies. And as such, they are no longer part of imperial preference, and they have to pay £18 per tonne on oil that they export into Britain. Were they able to do? And in addition, the British become wider ranging in their whaling activity. So we were saying earlier on that in the 1630s or thereabouts, the Dutch marched by moving into new fishery off the coast of Greenland. The British do a similar thing. They move on to the other side of Greenland, the western coast this time. They move through the Davis Straits and into Baffin Bay. And here the whales are, to begin with, extremely common. And also in the open water on that side of Greenland, the weather is actually better than on the other side most of the time. And as a result of this success, by the mid-1780s, the British whaling fleet is twice the size of the entire whaling fleets of Europe. It declines a bit in the 1790s, but then revives. And the most prosperous period for British whaling and for London whaling begins around 1795.
And this is the age of expansion then, going southwards?
Yes, so up to this stage, the British have been restricted to the so-called northern fishery. This has a legal definition. It's north of 59 degrees latitude. And there's a legal definition because this is where the bounty is payable. The British will then subsidise to some extent the southern fishery, but it's done through a system of premiums. And those premiums are much, much fewer, much harder to come by than the bounty payable in the northern fishery. And the trade grows because of various entrepreneurial figures who have often been deeply involved in the American trade before this. And the key figure here really is Samuel Enderby. He's also joined by other men, St. Barb and Champion. These men developed the southern fisheries, but they're also very important in lobbying the government. Enderby, in particular, is the first person to send a whaling voyage round the Cape of Good Hope. Now, there's a problem here because once you get beyond the Cape of Good Hope, you've got the East India Company, which in theory has a monopoly over sailing there. And you also have the Spanish Empire, which is hostile to British incursions into there. Enderby lobbies heavily, and he's able to finally get permission to go into the Pacific Ocean. One of the key developments here is the gradual development of the colony in Australia. One of the things that the whalers are able to do to some extent is to pay for the outward voyage to Australia for carrying convicts out there and then proceed on whaling. And one of the key developments here is that Enderby is the first man to send a ship round. The first ship that does this is the Amelia, which he owned in 1789. The Amelia returns with a full cargo, encouraging other ships to do it. The Enderbys are a whaling dynasty. The Samuel I'm talking about is Samuel Enderby, number 2. There was number 1, his father. Number 3 was one of his sons. Melville makes some jokey comment about the number of Samuel Enderbys. When Samuel Enderby dies, the business is then taken on by his 3 sons, of whom Samuel is one. But the main name is Charles, and Charles is a founding member of the Royal Geographical Society, and it is under his aegis that Antarctica is circumnavigated for the first time in 1830 by one of his captains, John Biscoe, in the brig Tula. And if you look at a map of an atlas of Antarctica, there is a huge area of it called Enderby Land. And the Enderbys are based initially at St. Paul's Wharf. Under the third generation of Enderbys, they also developed important works at Greenwich. So in East Greenwich, there is today an area called Enderby's Wharf, which has been redeveloped as modern flats. And within that modern development, there's a restaurant where they have kept something called the Octagon Room. And the Octagon Room was part of Enderby House, which was the Enderby residence there. And Enderby House was built at about the same time as the Enderbys constructed a factory for making sails and rope and all of that there in East Greenwich. But unfortunately, most of this was destroyed by fire in 1845. But as mentioned, the Octagon Room does survive.
If we're talking about the whale trade, there was a rapid decline in the 1820s. Why was that?
One of the reasons for the decline is the gradual spread of ideas of free trade. And there are 2 elements to this. One is economic liberalism, the idea that free trade is the rational way to go. Another one is evangelical religion, which thinks that you should free the economy of the man-made obstructions so that you can see divine providence working through. Both of these feed into the gradual elimination of duties on a whole range of goods, of which the most famous one obviously is the Corn Laws. But one early symptom of this is the reduction in the bounty on a tonne of whale oil from the northern fishery to 20 shillings. There is also a dramatic fall in oil prices, and partly because the good times were dependent on demand for whale oil for the manufacture of military uniforms. And with the ending of the Napoleonic Wars, that is gone. Another big problem is that whale oil is increasingly being substituted by rape oil, and the duty on rape oil imports is also being reduced. And then the key thing is that with free trade, the duty on American imported whale oil is reduced. And it is the competition of the Americans and the Australians that will really put paid to London as a whaling centre. Also, there is substitution of whale oil from gas. So this is the beginnings of the period of gas lighting. And then, surprise, surprise, we've got that age-old problem of the Davis Straits getting harder and harder to fish in their terms as the whales are gradually eliminated. One aspect of this is that they have to get further and further north to capture the whales. This then becomes increasingly dangerous, and it leads to public outcry at the fate of the whalers. The big crisis here is in 1835, which leads to a big change in public attitudes towards Arctic whaling. 6 ships were sunk and some 600 men were caught in the ice, and a lot of them suffer from frostbite and scurvy. The Royal Navy sends a mission to rescue these men in 1835 and they get them out. But the following year, another 6 ships are blocked in by huge ice fields. As a result, by the 1840s, the number of British ships active in the Arctic is tiny. But these problems mentioned above also affect the southern fishery, and perhaps the key symptom of Britain's and London's decline is when Charles Enderby, the scion of the Enderby family, decides to pack his bags and leaves Britain for New Zealand. And in the 1820s, the number of ships, British ships going to the Pacific, fell by 50%. And by 1843, there are only 9 whalers in the southern fishery carrying the British flag. And then, as mentioned earlier, I think after 1850, there's a big change in technology. They get steam whalers, they get these mechanized harpoons. And this is a period which is dominated by the Norwegians.
Wow, fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us on today's episode. We've traced London's remarkable and at times dramatic journey through the world of whaling, beginning with the medieval Basque hunters and the Bay of Biscay, and following the city's rise as a global whaling powerhouse. With the expertise of Ian McDermid, we've explored the fearless expeditions into Arctic waters, the commercial manoeuvres of monopolistic companies, and the industry's transformation as it expanded to the distant southern oceans. We've seen how whale oil and baleen powered the growth of industry and shaped the fashions of entire eras, from Elizabethan courtly corsets to the Victorian craze. Along the way, intense competition with the Dutch and ingenuity of London's merchants and market shifts brought from boom to bust. Ultimately, technological changes, new alternatives, and the risk and hardship faced by crews led to London's slow retreat from whaling, marking the end of a defining chapter in the city's maritime story. If you'd like to know more about the South Sea bubble that we discussed, then you can listen to episode 27. To learn more about Enderby's in Greenwich, then Ian offers an alternative Greenwich walking tour. Thank you, Ian, for guiding us through these details.
Oh, my pleasure, Hazel.
I'm Hazel Baker. This has been the London History Podcast from londonguidedwalks.co.uk. Until next time.